Let's get into it. Welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time visiting, my name's Dan, and this is a channel that I created when I moved my family from the US to the West Africa country of Sierra Leone, and this is just a platform that I use to be able to share our experiences as well as some lessons learned and a lot of thoughts regarding evangelism and specifically world evangelism. And so today I want to talk about the idea of culture as it pertains to evangelism. And I guess a good place to start would just be considering that the Great Commission that Jesus gave his followers to go and make disciples of all nations, like that's a command that can only be accomplished if God's people, Christians, are willing to leave their own cultures and societies and go into different ones. You know, in other words, God calls his people to be culture crossers, all right? And so that's something that I want to learn how to excel in. And I'm not sure I'm at that level of proficiency yet. However, I want to start a dialogue on this channel for how we can excel in that. And so this will be the first of hopefully several videos that I'll upload that really tries to tackle different aspects of teaching the gospel, presenting the gospel in various contexts and cultures, and how we can better our approach and mentality towards that. Cool. There you go. Good job. I'm not sure it's possible to talk about the Great Commission of making disciples of all nations without first thinking of the example of the Apostle Paul. I'm not sure there's someone who's done more for that Great Commission and for that responsibility that God's given his people to go and spread the gospel really than Paul. I also think it's impossible for us to talk about this subject of adapting and adjusting to culture without establishing some foundational principles from Paul's remarks in 1 Corinthians 9, when he shares that he has become all things to all men. And in that text, 1 Corinthians 9, maybe 19 through 24, something around there, Paul shares that when he's talking to Jews, he changes his approach and his methods. When he's talking to a Gentile, he adjusts his approach, his methods. When he talks to someone who's weak, when he talks to someone who is under law, basically sharing that when he is approaching someone with the gospel, he takes inventory of where they're coming from, who they are, what's their background, and then adjusts accordingly. Now, what exactly is he adjusting? Well, let's just make it clear. I don't think he's talking about changing the gospel, changing the message of the good news of Christ, all right? If you're on the fence about whether or not that's a possibility, just read the book of Galatians, specifically chapter 1, where Paul shares some super strong words to those who would change the gospel and alter the message of the gospel. He's not talking about that. Similarly, even in this book in 1 Corinthians, he gives some strong rebukes to those who would seek to change and alter the gospel to fit into societal and cultural standards and morals and norms. And so I think that is also off the table. So he's saying, I'm looking at someone, seeing where they're coming from, looking at their background, looking at their culture, I'm adjusting to them, but he's not adjusting the message. Well, then what else could he be adjusting? So the only explanation that really makes sense to me is that Paul is telling us that his message is not changing depending upon who he's talking to, but rather how he presents the message, how he demonstrates the gospel, and how he communicates the gospel. And this is where I think the context of 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19 through 24 is really interesting. Because in chapters 8 and 9, Paul is talking about this very controversial subject within the church at Corinth. And his main point in these chapters regarding this controversial topic is that we ought to be willing to sacrifice what we perceive to be our preference or our rights for the sake of those around us. That's his major point in verses 8 and 9, is that whenever I'm given a choice to sacrifice my wants and my preferences and my rights for the sake of someone else, I ought to make that choice every time. If it does not transgress God's will, if I am not disobeying God in any way, but rather just simply sacrificing what I want, then I need to be willing to do that. And Paul would exhort me to do that. And in fact, if I refuse to do that, then I am violating the very principle that Paul is presenting in 1 Corinthians 8 and 9. Which means that this idea of adapting my methods of communication and presentation of the gospel is not simply something I should do but don't have to do. It's something that if I refuse to do it, I am violating Scripture. So this just becomes a lot bigger deal when we think about it in those terms. But I can't imagine it can be understated just how maybe challenging this approach can be, all right? I think all of us have a natural way of communicating, a natural way of presenting ourselves, a natural way of living out some of these things. But Paul is saying it's important for us to be able to put other people's benefit above our own comfort zone, in front of our own preferences. But within this text, Paul makes it clear what's motivating him to do this hard and challenging thing. In verse 22, he shares that he does all this so that by all means I may win some. According to Paul, this kind of adjustment to the people that he's speaking to and interacting with was an aid and a benefit to winning them to Christ. That just raises the stakes, doesn't it, a little bit, right? That Paul saw that this would aid his ability to be able to win souls for Christ if he gave up his own natural methods of communication and presentation and kind of how we normally thought through things and did things, that would benefit someone significantly enough that it would lead to their salvation. Now, if that's true, then wouldn't the opposite also be true? That if I refuse to adjust, if I refuse to adapt, if I refuse to change up and adjust my communication style or my habits or my mannerisms or whatever it is for the sake of other people, if I refuse to do that, then I perhaps am setting a stumbling block or a barrier for someone being won to Christ. I don't know about you, but the idea of doing that makes me extremely uncomfortable. So this next point is going to be more or less a speculation of mine, and so it probably should be heard with that in mind. But one observation I can just kind of throw out there for your consideration is that Paul, because of his unique background, I think was uniquely gifted at this sort of thing. Okay, so there are probably numerous reasons why God chose Paul to be an apostle to the Gentiles, that he was the one that God chose and selected to really kickstart the evangelistic work of the gospel in faraway nations and in places. Like I said, probably plenty of reasons why God chose Paul, but perhaps one of those reasons is that Paul's background gifted him the ability to, more easily than most, to be able to adapt to different cultures and different backgrounds of people that he would interact with on his various preaching and mission trips. And what leads me to think that is because Paul, he was a Jew, but he was also a Roman citizen. You think about, wow, like what a gift that was to be able to relate to people on different levels because of that reality. He wasn't just a Jew, he was a Pharisee, but also he converted to Christianity. That made him very uniquely capable of being able to see the connections and the differences and the alignments of different backgrounds, even within that, theological sphere. Furthermore, Paul said in the book of Philippians that he knew how to live with an abundance, but he also had experienced times of great poverty in his life, okay? So even the idea of an economic situation, Paul was familiar with both sides. And so you imagine what kind of equipping these, experiences and backgrounds had upon Paul when he would go into different cultures, even if he wasn't specifically familiar with that specific culture. I think having that diverse background gave him some sort of ability to be able to adapt in those ways. So with that said, I think there are going to be some people that are more naturally gifted and effective at what we're talking about today, with being able to observe a culture, being able to identify how we need to respond in our adjustments to that culture. But I also feel very strongly that this is a skill and an ability that can be developed. And I'll point to myself in that regard. I grew up in a very, I would perceive as being non-diverse area in central Indiana. At least in the pocket where I was living, not a whole lot of diversity of different cultures, different backgrounds. But before moving to Sierra Leone, I lived 8 years in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. Now, on one hand, you'd say, okay, that doesn't exactly seem like the most natural stepping stone, going from a metropolitan area like downtown Boston to moving to a more rural and less developed region like West Africa. But in fact, it was an incredible blessing for me because within Boston, I was able to interact with people of all different sorts of cultures and ethnicities and languages and all these sorts of things, and that equipped me with an ability to be able to understand that I need to make adjustments, but also to know like what kind of observations I need to be making when trying to evaluate someone's background, someone's culture, someone's communication style, and then adjust to that. And so I think this is something that can be learned and can be developed. So within these next few months, I want to be uploading several videos that are sharing my personal insights and observations and lessons learned regarding observing culture, learning culture, adjusting to culture, and I really want to specifically focus and emphasize the idea of how this affects those who want to teach cross-culturally. And I'll be sharing, obviously, the majority of my observations from a Sierra Leonean context. However, I feel like that could be helpful. So if this is something that you're interested in, then a couple things for you. Number one, this will be a series, and I'll include a link to a playlist in the description below that has all the videos that I produced so far on this topic in that playlist. Number two, if this is content that you're interested in, consider subscribing, all right? This is one way of being able to be more certain that as I upload more content on this subject and subjects related to this, that you be notified of that. Another reason why you should like this video and subscribe is because it indicates to the YouTube algorithm that this is a video worth promoting. And I think messages like this, especially to Christians who are eager to teach the gospel, are just extremely important. And so if you think that is too, then those are a few things that you can do in order to help kind of push that forward. All right, that's all for now. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.